it's probably been 7 or 8 years since I saw Blow Up, and I don't remember much of it. But the scene with the mimes playing tennis at the end, the scene with Thomas walking out onto the street after a concert, some of the shots of him hanging up film and pictures, these are going to stay with me for a long, long time. Similarly with Zabriskie Point, I don't remember huge parts of that movie, but the opening where we go inside a student organizing meeting, that has always stuck with me. And that scene where everything blows up, which maybe that should be in the other movie, but that scene has always stuck with me. For me, Antonioni, I guess, has always been a director of poignant moments, and I think The Passenger is no different. I saw it last week, and I've already forgotten some parts of it, but there are a couple of pieces that are so striking and powerful that probably never forget them. I'll get to those scenes in a second, but I don't want to sell the movie short. I don't mean to say that it's boring or that only a few scenes that are good. I wouldn't recommend only watching the scenes that really spoke to me. That probably wouldn't make much sense. The big selling point of The Passenger is that it's one of 3 Antonioni films made in English. The other ones I just mentioned. Where this really has the edge over Blow Up and Zabriskie Point is the cast. Now, Blow Up has Vanessa Redgrave in it, and it features the Yardbirds, and Daria Halprin is in Zabriskie Point, a very interesting person for you to look up. Those movies definitely have interesting casts, but The Passenger has Jack Nicholson and Maria Schneider in it. I had no idea that those actors were ever in a movie together, let alone a film by Michelangelo Antonioni. At first, this might seem like kind of a bizarre alliance, but I think it actually makes a lot of sense. In Zabriskie Point and Blow Up, Antonioni has protagonists that are isolated and alienated. And who was the poster child of isolation and alienation in the 1970s? It was Jack Nicholson, I guess. Maria Schneider did pretty good job with alienation herself. I guess younger audiences might associate Jack Nicholson more with being a grumpy old man or possibly a weird middle-aged man. But that's not what made him. I've done a review on 5 Easy Pieces. That's a great example of Nicholson as a talisman of this disenchanted 1970s guy. And really, it's kind of a similar thing here. Probably the biggest concern of Nicholson throughout his eras is that he's not dynamic, and that might be true. Now, I will probably break a few hearts by saying that I thought Maria Schneider was not that great in this movie. I think by 1975, her life may have already been starting to spiral out of control a bit. I think it shows. The performance is pretty stilted. Now, I know that some people think she's great in this movie. Maybe I'm being too harsh. To be fair, she was kind of stilted in Last Tango in Paris, too, but I think it works there, and it gives a sort of naturalism. I don't know. For me, it didn't quite work in this movie. One last thing before we really get into the movie is that it was shot by Luciano Tovoli, who shot The Desert of the Tartars, which I reviewed 2 weeks ago. There is some method to the madness on this channel, although just wait until you see what we'll be doing next week. Anyway, this movie doesn't look as cool as The Desert of the Tartars, which is an all-time great in terms of cinematography, but it has some cool shots, including one fairly famous shot at the end that I will talk through. It also has a couple scenes that actually don't look that great, mainly towards the beginning, really grainy handheld footage. Jack Nicholson apparently liked this movie so much that he bought the rights to it when it was released, partly so that he could control its distribution a little bit, and in the end it did help him negotiate a favorable re-release, a fancy remaster or something. I'm not sure if this is the version that I watched. It didn't look like it was given a fancy treatment exactly, and I also didn't have the commentary track by Jack Nicholson, which I would love to listen to, although I suspect he maybe rambles a bit even more than me, perhaps. I just couldn't track that down in time to make this video, sadly. Overall, you'll see The Passenger. It's a cool movie. There's a lot to it. Let me try to give you the basic plot, but I guess you're going to see that I guess the basic plot doesn't actually have much to do with what happens in the movie. Jack Nicholson plays a reporter named David Locke, who is on location somewhere in Africa. It's very sandy. I think it's probably Chad, is what various sources say, but you wouldn't know that from watching the movie unless you know a lot about Chad. But there's no subtitles introducing you to where you are. He's shooting some film clips for a documentary. Not very successfully, but he's doing his best. And he meets a guy named Robertson, who is also on location in Africa, but not as a reporter. He's working some kind of corporate job. Robertson passes away, and David Locke, for one reason or another, assumes his identity. He fakes his own death, takes over this other guy's life. And soon he realizes that this other guy, Robertson, now him, is an arms dealer. This isn't really too big of a spoiler. This is the beginning of the movie, and this isn't really a movie that can be spoiled in some ways. I guess the plot here might sound like an action movie, but I think it's actually kind of the opposite of that. And I don't mean that it's boring, exactly. I had a friend in college who told me that he was a fan of anything that aims to deconstruct something else, anything that tries to take something else apart. And I think you'd like this movie because in some ways it kind of takes apart other movies. That's what I mean by being the opposite of an action movie. It's hard to put your finger on this kind of thing, but I'll try to give you a few specific examples. The movie opens up with Locke trying to set up a meeting with gorillas in the desert. The gorillas are hidden away in some dunes, so Locke has to jump through a bunch of hoops to find them. He starts out in a town and he gives a man some cigarettes. That leads him to another person who gives him directions. He gets a guide and so on. This idea of the secret rendezvous, it's very common in movies. And it's similar to a lot of other common things. Scavenger hunts, detectives following a trail of clues, a chase even. One thing leading to another. It's right up there with some of the most fundamental forms of dramatic logic. In this movie, though, we don't really get that. We sort of start to get it, but it doesn't really follow the rules. The links from one step to another are unclear. It seems like Antonioni deliberately cuts around them at times. For example, Locke pays one of the people in the village. Then he goes to get into his car, he gets into a car, which apparently you learned is his, although it wasn't quite established like that very firmly. And then it turns out that there's a small child sitting in the car as well. You don't really see the kid get in. The small child leads him somewhere and then just kind of gets out and leaves. Then Locke wanders into the dune and then he finds another guy. At first, it might just seem like the movie doesn't make sense. It's missing like these crucial shots of like, oh, he sees the guy, or oh, he gave him the money and then the guy points, hey, that guy. Any shot like that has just been eliminated from the movie. It might seem like it's incompetency, but I think it's Antonioni's subversive sensibility. You see this all over the place in the movie. Another example, after Locke sort of inexplicably fails to meet the gorillas, he finds himself back in the desert, and he gets his car stuck in the sand. He looks around for a bit, and the movie sets this up as a big problem. He kicks the tires, he has a shovel, he tries to dig it out, he tries some things, it doesn't work. It's setting up this conflict, and you wonder, how will he resolve the conflict? How will he get himself out of it? Well, the next thing you see is him wandering back into town. So if this were an episode of MacGyver, they would have skipped over the part where MacGyver builds the cool contraption. They would have skipped over the solution to the problem. That's the dramatic formula being turned on its head. So in some ways, this movie is kind of anti-dramatic, I guess. And you could make a case for it maybe being a bit deconstructionist, is what I'm trying to say. Let me also point out that there's kind of a pretty crucial pattern in the things I just mentioned, which is that the movie has a somewhat funny relationship between what we see on camera and what actually happens in the story. That might sound a little vague, but it's a big part of the movie. For now, I'll just say that there's a lot of stuff that you would expect to see that you don't see. Interesting relationship between the action and what is actually filmed. Like I said, this is not an action movie. Some words that are more fitting would be ambiguous, dispassionate, existential, right? Let me mention something really interesting about the two characters in the beginning, Locke and Robertson. Locke is a reporter and Robertson's an arms dealer, like I said. These guys are hanging out in the same places. They're participating in the same conflict. But for the reporter, it's a passive role, observational, removed, looking at things. For the gunrunner, it's completely the opposite. This is someone who is actively involved in the conflict, someone who enables them. Now, what type of power do they have? Maybe it's still minimal in some ways, but this is a much less passive role. This is a very different type of agency. I think these two modes, sort of this, the passivity of the reporter and the agency of the gunrunner, kind of sum up the whole movie. Remember, Locke gives up his identity as the reporter to become this other guy who is a gunrunner. He doesn't immediately take to his life, though, in part because he doesn't really know what's going on. But maybe there's a deeper reason, too. I think, really, in a lot of ways, this entire movie is kind of, the question is, what is the deeper reason? What is the thing going on inside of his head that made him first want to say goodbye to his life and then sort of hesitant to pick up someone else's. The movie, I think, in a lot of ways, has the feeling of someone watching their life from the outside. And I think that that Nicholson, as Locke and Robertson, really spends most of the movie oscillating between these two modes, the agency and the more passive thing. I was reminded a little bit of when I was a kid in school, like elementary school, and I would have a dentist appointment or something, and my dad would come and pick me up and take me out of school. And this feeling of like walking out of the hallways and then going out to the parking lot while everyone else was in class, you like hear sort of the hum of the classrooms and you're just walking out on your own. Weird feeling, like watching your life from the outside. This movie's called The Passenger. Remember, the original Italian title translates to profession reporter, which is maybe a bit less ambiguous, maybe. With The Passenger, you wonder, who is the passenger? Maybe it brings to mind that saying about being a passenger in your own life, something passive. Who's the passenger? Who's the driver? Anyway, I'm going to talk about two, I think, really interesting developments that keep things moving along in the film. Jack Nicholson meets Maria Schneider's character, who I think is just known as the girl, which is a square in auteur film bingo, women characters that don't even get names and just sort of represent abstract sexual fulfillment or something like that. Honestly, to me, Maria Schneider's character isn't one of the more interesting parts of the movie. You might say that, again, we get some deconstructive elements here, some deconstruction of romantic relationships. She kind of comes and goes, right? And usually when that happens in a movie, it's a poignant moment. That's the whole point of romantic drama is, oh, the people come together, they're apart, this tension of being apart, and the triumph of coming back together in these critical moments where that happens, right? Here we kind of skip over all the scenes like that. There's an interesting moment, actually, where Jack Nicholson, in sort of the earlier parts of the movie, walks past Maria Schneider just randomly sitting on the street. He doesn't know her. And later he says, oh, did I see you in London? And she says, I don't know, maybe. It's just an empty coincidence. This, again, to me, feels like some sort of taking apart other movies a little bit, because usually this would be some really ornate plot mechanic, right? The idea of the romantic coincidence of having seen somebody before, right? Usually that would be in the script. That'd be a key part of the story, not just like, oh, weird, like this person happened to be there. Anyway, I do think there's something kind of interesting to the way that they omit some of the crucial romantic moments. But other than that, I'm not actually deeply interested in the character, really. I think Locke might have an even more interesting relationship with a different woman, which is his wife. It takes us a while to even realize that he is married. It turns out that he also has a child, which we never see, and which is never referred to by any character. Again, interesting choices about what the camera sees and what it doesn't. Usually, a kid would be an empathetic engine in a movie like this, would be a focal point, right? This guy is faking his own death. Surely, there's some drama there with his family and with his kid. Well, not here. Locke goes back to London after his supposed death. He stops by his house to pick up some documents, and he learns that his wife has been having an affair. And we see, I guess, that their relationship has been pretty empty. Nonetheless, the wife, her name's Rachel, becomes pulled into the mystery a little bit. We see her become kind of distant in her affair because she's thinking about Locke. Interesting switcheroo. I don't have a lot to say about this in some ways, but Rachel trying to track down her husband does give the film a few flickers of action, and more importantly, her sort of becoming interested in him posthumously, for some reason, really speaks to me. There's sort of morbid curiosity. I don't know. I like this element. I think it adds a nice dynamic to the movie as it goes on. It also leads us to another important thing, which is that some of David's colleagues decide that they want to make a documentary honoring him after he dies. They call up Rachel. This is one of the ways we're really introduced to her in the movie. And these documentarians, along with Rachel, watch through some of the footage that Locke shot in Africa. The movie jumps back in time here and there. It's not the decisive flashbacks of an episode of The West Wing, but the footage, the portraits, are interesting. In part, I guess, because this is what Locke was filming as he was slipping out of his own life, as he was coming to this place where he was ready to fake his death and become somebody else. These were the things he was witnessing, right? You see in the footage countless hints of journalistic passivity. In fact, at one point, Rachel actually went to visit him in Africa, but only stayed for one day. We get a flashback to this, not through the footage, but a real flashback. And we see her criticize Locke for not confronting a dictator who's lying in an interview. He says, well, those are the rules, right? She wants him to ask some tougher questions. A bit later, we see some footage which is of an execution, a real one. I read an interview where Antonioni refused to say where they got this footage, but insisted that it was real, right? So Locke filmed people lying, and he filmed people dying. I can picture maybe some people reacting negatively to the anonymity and the vagaries of the African scenes in this movie. It does seem almost like a hypothetical situation rather than a real conflict. But it's also a remarkably serious thing. Like I said, we see a real execution in this movie. It's possible that some of the alienation, some of the lack of context, lack of agency is part of what disheartened Locke. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's possible that this movie is deliberately sort of not engaging with the African context, and that's part of the story, the difficulty, the cultural incommensurability, the failures of the West to be able to do this, and Locke feeling sort of helpless and passive, I guess. Right before this movie, Antonioni actually made a movie. He made a documentary about China. He went there and he filmed some working class people, followed them around. The movie is called Chung Kuo China. It's from 1972, television movie in the end, I think. I haven't seen it. This movie was viciously criticized by the Chinese government and some communists in Italy as well for being anti-communist. Interesting twist there. It's not hard to imagine how the events around the production of that movie and the reception may have led to some of the ideas in this movie. Again, this is a movie that makes a big fuss over what the camera sees and what it doesn't. It makes a big fuss over the difference between a reporter and an arms dealer. I think those themes are pretty darn fitting for a movie about someone trying to hang on to some kind of identity. Key idea in the movie, out there in this big, confusing, global world. Let me end by mentioning the two scenes that I think will stick with me the most. Actually, first let me mention the end, which isn't one of those two scenes, but it's pretty famous. Maybe the most well-known thing about this movie is the penultimate shot. It's a really, really long take. It's kind of a cool shot. They had to do, sort of impressive for the time to move the camera in the way that they do. It's a long take that kind of shows us nothing, but kind of shows us everything. Those two are sort of one and the same. Here the camera seems to become almost entirely decoupled from the characters, which is an interesting contrast to the way that 99% of movies work, where the story, the camera, is inherently kind of linked to somebody, some thread. Here, the camera almost loses its identity. Identity goes out the window. It's cool. I've never seen an Antonioni movie with a decisive ending, and this does not break from that tradition. The movie kind of spirals into ultimate ambiguity. I think the ending's great, to be honest, but it wasn't my favorite part. The two scenes that really stuck out to me are both, I guess, in the second half of the movie. The first one is of Jack Nicholson and Maria Schneider cruising down the road in a convertible. Schneider is sitting in the back, and we get some really nicely composed shots of her with the road going past, and she asks David, hey, can I ask you a question? He says, sure. She says, it's just one question, always the same. What are you running from? And David says, look behind you. And she does, and behind her, there's nothing except the road just running away. And I don't know why, but this scene is incredibly beautiful to me. A bit later on, we get another scene, a very simple scene. This is towards the end. A very simple scene just of two people talking, just of the two of them talking, David and the girl. And David telling her about a blind man who regains his sight. Yeah, might sound like a ninth grade English class, but it's a very poignant scene. So, look, there's more to the movie than these two scenes. That's what stuck out to me. It's a dense movie. Hopefully I've scratched the surface a little bit in this review. Maybe it's a good start. I watched this movie because it had Nicholson and Schneider in it and was directed by Antonioni, and sometimes that kind of thing ends up being a novelty or a gimmick, but this is really a nice movie. Cool. Yeah, it's a bit slow, but if you adjust your mental clock, I think it's rewarding with a lot of compelling subtext and a lot of life just shared with you in a way that goes so far beyond the typical sort of narrative constructs of most movies.